How's it going, everybody, and welcome back to Genesis Barbell. Today we are bringing you another video on advanced protocols, and this one is specifically for the types of training blocks that you aren't used to, the ones that we throw in between our standardized training, but very useful training blocks that you can consider for the future. So tune in and enjoy.
All right, so we're going to be looking at a couple of different training phases that is going to be different from our general strength blocks or peaking blocks or volume blocks. And these are going to be a little bit of a once in a while type of training phase, and but they're definitely necessary for us to understand when things are fluctuating in our training or in our lifestyle, and we're going to be looking at exactly what to do with our volume, with our intensity, with our exercise selection, with how we structure it, and how we can lay out training properly so that we don't miss out on anything, and can still make gains in whatever aspect that we can do that in. So we're going to talk about 4 different phases, and the first one will be a deficit phase. So basically, when you are in a calorie deficit, you're trying to lose some fat tissue. I think this is a very necessary aspect of powerlifting. I know that the stereotypical outlook on powerlifting is very much just eat whatever you want, train heavy, train hard, and just get as strong as possible. And that has its place, but at the same time, our coefficient score, whether that's dots or walks or whatever it is, that is still a major part of the sport. That is the determining factor between who's the better powerlifter from a sporting point of view. So we need to understand that our actual body weight plays a massive role. I feel like this is so obvious, I don't even know why I need to say all of this, but fat tissue just doesn't do us a lot of good. And so we're going to talk about what training is going to be looking like when we are in a period where we're trying to lose fat. Next, we'll be looking at a maintenance phase. This is basically your holiday training. So I have a lot of clients that have 2, 3, maybe even 4-week periods where they go on holiday or work is just crazy. Something in their life has come up, and we need to just manage our training. Performance is going down, whatever the case may be. And so we jump on a maintenance block just to keep our general abilities consistent, and provide a little bit more of a baseline to start building from when we can focus more on our training. So, being on holiday is a big one for some of my clients, and nutrition is terrible or just not as consistent and reliable. Might not necessarily be able to get in as many training days. The gyms that are available to you might not have particular types of equipment, etc. So all of those things need to be considered. Then we've got something I call an MED, or minimal effective dose block, something that's minimally effective to still make gains. It's going to be very similar to a maintenance block, but instead of it being this sort of kind of last resort, it's going to have a very specific purpose. We're pulling back for good reason, and I'm going to explain all of that when we get there. Then we've got a hypertrophy phase. Lots of powerlifters don't like this either. I feel like training to lose fat, or not necessarily the training, but the idea of losing fat or cutting, and the idea of specifically aiming to put on muscle is very much frowned upon in the powerlifting scene, and I don't know why. My natural inkling is that it makes our food intake a little bit more strict and a little bit more managed, and I think that's maybe one reason why a lot of people don't, or why a lot of people do powerlifting, is because they want to get away from that pressure of needing to kind of keep an eye on their nutrition. And I think that's crazy, because your nutrition is I don't want to say everything, because that's definitely over exaggerating, but goodness, it's got such a role in our performance, it's got such a role in how we how well we do as an athlete. So definitely, if you don't have control over your nutrition, don't run to powerlifting, run to better self-control. That's always the answer. This plays a massive role in your sport. So anyway, we're going to be looking at how to specifically build muscle and what training phases are going to look like in order to achieve that goal. So let's start with the first one of my favorites, the caloric deficit phase. Now, most importantly to note is when we are doing any type of training for powerlifting, we need to understand that building muscle, which obviously won't happen necessarily in a deficit, and building acute strength, so a particular muscle group like the quads producing more force, that's not particularly going to happen either. And that's simply for the fact that our restricted calories will inhibit us from pretty much doing as much volume and as high intensity. We just won't be able to produce as much force in our accessory training or any of our training to be able to exhibit novel stimulus for better strength gains and hypertrophy gains. So does that mean that you can't get acutely stronger in a deficit? No, you still can, but I don't think it's worth specifically focusing and determining yourself to be able to do that in a deficit. I think there's a time and place to do that when you aren't in a deficit, and there's a time when we can focus on other things. And that's what we're doing here. Not everything in our training is building muscle and acutely strengthening certain tissues. It is our technique and skill as well, and something else that we'll get into. So most importantly in a deficit, what you want to do is hone your skill. So when we are squatting, I'm going to put squat for, the squat is a very it's the go-to movement of the three to use as an example. So I'm just going to use the squat. What we want to make sure of is that we have our skill down and consistent. So doing the typical, something that I maybe have a slight thing against, but I have to admit that in this case it is the most appropriate thing to do, is for all three lifts have some sort of RPE gauge for a top single, whether that's an RPE 7, 8, what have you. And that can stay pretty consistent throughout a training block. So from week 1 all the way to week 6, 7, 8, 9, 15, whatever you want to do, however long you want your deficit to be. Obviously, we'll have some maintenance phases, and we'll talk about that as well. But typically, you can have one single at a specific RPE, depending on where you are on your caloric restriction. I think if you are deep into a calorie deficit, round about RPE 7, not much higher, but RPE 7 or RPE 8 can stay consistent, because we're not going to progressively overload just for the sake of progressively overloading. Okay, if you can do more, do more. It's RPE based. That's based on how you feel on the day. Typically, we will have a slight decline in performance as time goes on in a deficit. So this number can stay consistent, and the actual weight that you're doing will slightly go down or at least remain the same. And possibly even go up if you are not very experienced with just doing lots of singles, and you do them now consistently. Even being in a deficit, you might be able to get better at doing singles and might still be able to lift more weight from week to week. That's very possible. Then we're going to have back downs. Now, volume wise, we'll talk about, I'm just going to put a random number here. So 3 sets. Let me take this merge away. 3 sets of, say, 7 reps. Why are you doing that now? And that's going to be based on a percentage of the RPE. Now, if you know how I structure training, we only ever need 1 RPE. We don't need to put in here RPE 8 again, because that can make it very confusing as to what to take going from a single to sets of 7. It can be very difficult to manage what we think we can do. So what's the easiest thing to do is, after we do this top single that is already RPE based, if we put a percentage here based on this set, okay, whatever we do will still be according to how we feel on this specific day. So over here, I can put in however much I want to, and that's based on how you calculate it. I usually take this number that we do, say this is a 200 kilo, right? We do 200 kilos for a single at RPE 8. That will equate to a 200 triple at RPE 10. You calculate the estimate of that, the 1 rep max estimate, and then you put a number here based on that estimate. Okay, and so let's say this is maybe 75 is a bit much. Let's say 72% of top set. Okay, so then you throw in a percentage based on the RPE. So when we are doing this, we are allowing the individual to get in a good amount of sets, a good amount of reps, and that's the idea with this. Might be a little bit higher rep count than what you may be used to, and that's the idea here. We want skill practice. We want to get under the bar and squat reps upon reps upon reps, not to the death. Theoretically, if we can do sets of 20 reps, fantastic. The problem is the weight on the bar is just going to be too low to have any sort of technical demand. Plus, you're going to be cardiovascularly depleted. It's just not going to be a fun time. You're not going to get a whole lot out of it. So we want to have a significant amount of reps to get in the skill practice, but not too high that we're actually not having enough weight on the bar to demand a lot from our technique, because that's the idea, right, is technical demand. And so we're building our technique, doing the single with the back downs. Then what are we going to do? Well, most importantly in a deficit, well, not most importantly, but the next most important thing is holding on to our muscle tissue. So this is going to be very, very crucial because we might not be able to build muscle necessarily, but we can maintain muscle. And we definitely do not want to lose muscle mass. So what are we going to do? We're going to have some volume on every single muscle group that we do. So we're going to have a quad accessory, a hamstring accessory. Depending on how you structure all your days, you'll be able to fill out which muscle groups you need to work on this day. Typically, this is fairly enough work. We might have another hamstring accessory and then another quad accessory on a deadlift day, etc., etc. So it really depends on how you structure it. But at the end of the day, what we want is enough volume. So very, very simple. Okay. We would naturally think that our maintenance volume is going to be the go-to during a deficit phase. So we've got, let's say, the single doesn't really count because that's barely any stimulus from a tissue perspective, but 3 sets on the quads, then say we've got another 3 sets here and 4 sets of hamstrings, and that is roughly around the maintenance volume that we need if we're going to repeat a day like this with a quad and hamstring accessory. Roughly the amount of volume that we need to maintain our muscle mass. Very low, 8 sets of quads a week, 8 sets, 9 sets of hamstrings a week, and we're good to go to maintain muscle mass. But that's maintenance volume in a maintenance caloric intake. So when we are training and we've got maintenance volume laid out, that needs to be coherent as to what our caloric intake is. So when we are in a deficit, and the deeper we are in a deficit, the more volume it's going to take to hold onto the muscle tissue. So this is a difficult one because there's definitely a balance between doing too much volume where we're actually breaking down tissue and kind of shooting ourselves in the foot because we're actually doing it to hold on to muscle mass and now we're losing it. And that would be closer to our typical maximum recoverable volume, when we're doing so much volume that we can typically handle during normal phases of our diet. Now that might be too high. But if we stick around only on the lower end by maintenance volume, that's typical maintenance volume, now it's going to be too little to be able to exhibit enough stimulus to hold onto the tissue. We're going to need more stimulus. So this might be a little bit of a play on your head, but think about it like this. Your maintenance volume throughout a deficit period is going to change. So maintenance volume in week 1 of your cut might be 8 sets of quads, but maintenance volume in week 10 of your cut might be 14 sets. Okay, the reason for that is we just need more volume to maintain the muscle mass the deeper we are in our deficit. And so maintenance volume is a arbitrary term that's going to be malleable. It's going to change. And so we need to keep an eye out on that. Typically, how we like to set it up is we've got our typical maintenance volume, our general amount of volume that you need to hold onto muscle mass during a normal maintenance phase in terms of diet. Okay, and then we've got MRV, which is maximum recoverable volume. No matter how much we eat, no matter how much we sleep, no matter what we do, that is the maximum amount of volume our tissue can tolerate in a very specific state with specific exercises, etc. So say this is 8 sets for quads, and that's 20 sets. Okay, during a deficit, we are going to sit in between and range between, let's say, 10 sets to about 16 sets. Oh my goodness, are you really going to do this to me? Sorry about that. 10 sets to about 16 sets. Because 8 sets might be too little to hold onto the muscle tissue. 20 is going to be way too much. We're going to start losing. So we're going to sit around the middle here. And so we start off with 10, and with every week or every 2 weeks, we're going to up it until we get to, say, 16, where we feel, okay, I can't recover from more than this. This is the max that I can do. What do we do then? Because we can't do more volume, we can't do less volume. Do we stick around at the same volume, or is that going to become inefficient? What do we do after we've reached this top end here during our deficit? Well, we need to have a diet maintenance phase. And that's why we have these maintenance phases in the diet. Not just to resensitize ourselves to caloric restriction, but also to resensitize our tissue, okay, to the volume. So we run through this range until we get to, say, week 8 or week 10 in our deficit, and then we go, we can't do more volume, we can't do less volume, we can't do the same volume. What do we do? Well, we change the deficit, and we have a maintenance week where we eat in a caloric maintenance state. Okay, that will give our body enough nutrients to be able to maintain muscle easier. You have maintenance training, so you drop the sets or the volume down to 8, 10 sets or whatever, and then you revamp it back up as you go back into a deficit. And that's exactly how it's going to work. We're going to increase volume during our deficit phase. We're going to reach the end point. We're going to do a maintenance, and then we're going to start all over again with the volume increases. And so it goes on and on and on. And that's going to be perfect because we want these diet maintenance periods, whether it's a week or 2 weeks, throughout our diet to not only help us in training like we are now, but to also resensitize our body to the deficit intake, the lower caloric intake. Because if we keep dieting, our body's metabolic rate will adapt. We will generally just be doing less, we'll be fidgeting less, we'll be lazier. You won't necessarily always know it, but your basal metabolic rate is going to drop, your heart rate is going to drop, your activity is going to drop no matter how much cardio you force yourself to do. Everything is going to drop and your body is going to adapt, right? And become efficient at the little amount of nutrients that or macronutrients and calories that it's getting in. And so your best bet is going to be to do a maintenance period from a diet perspective and revamp all of those things and then start fresh again. So that's going to be the best way to go about doing that. One extra thing that you can throw in terms of variations, because now you might be asking yourself, well, okay, so of the 3 lifts, am I only doing those 3 lifts and nothing else? Well, you can throw in variations, but from my experience and with my athletes, the best thing to do is to have a very, very novel variation. So a good example here is if you've done tempo squats, paused squats, pause above parallel squats, close stance squats, wide stance squats, etc., etc. You've done all forms of variations of a normal low bar squat. What is going to be a really good idea here? Well, maybe something like a ATG high bar, or just a normal high bar squat, a safety bar squat. Those things will be very fresh and novel. And the reason why we want something very novel is because, think about it like this. I'm going to maybe use a little bit of a better example here. If we were to do some sort of deadlift variation, let's say, for example, you've always worn a belt in your deadlifts. You've always either pulled from the floor or from blocks. You've done all sorts of pauses, controlled eccentrics, RDLs, etc., etc., etc. But you've never really done deficits, and you've never really done them, or you've never really done any beltless training. Now what we can do is we can have a beltless deficit deadlift. And what's that going to do? Well, because we have such little or restricted stimulus on, say, the erector tissue, okay, which might not be all too stimulated the way we've trained before, always having a belt on. Now remember, that still trains our erectors, of course, but anyone can admit taking off the belt is going to be a lot more demand than usual. So it's not that it doesn't train it with a belt on, we just are allowing very new stimulus on it without a belt. Same thing with the deficit. So when we incorporate these very fresh, novel aspects, we are stimulating tissue that has very much been on the back seat for very long, or just gotten used to the modality of training over a long period of time. And now we're throwing in something new, something fresh, and all of a sudden it's getting so much stimulus. So what does that do? Well, it's going to exhibit some strength gains. It's going to exhibit some better motor unit recruitment, because it just hasn't been stimulated, even in hypertrophy phases or general volume blocks or normal strength blocks or whatever you've been doing for months and months on end. This is going to be completely new stimulus, and whether you're in a deficit or not, the stimulus is going to be so great that your body is going to have to respond and adapt. And so that is the key here if we want to make very particular progressions still in a deficit phase, is to do very novel variations. We obviously want it to be a variant and not just something like a hyperextension, which can do the same or have the same type of stimulus. Because if we do a variation, that's got very specific carryover. And so that might facilitate some future gains. Plus, once we've kind of primed our nervous system, primed our technique with this very new movement, because obviously every new movement comes with a skill to develop. Once we've primed those, once we get back into a maintenance phase and then a hypertrophy phase or high volume phase or a general strength block, okay, we're going to take this movement that we have mastered and we're going to throw it into a block where we can start really pushing. That's going to exhibit some crazy gains on this variation, some fresh gains on this variation, and that's going to facilitate even more gains on our main lifts. So keep that in mind. That is one of the best tools I've ever used. It's doing novel movements during a deficit. It's going to have a lot of carryover that you usually might not have. So what's next is a maintenance block. Okay, this is going to be very similar in terms of the fact that we want to maintain skill. So we're going to have, let's use the bench. We're going to have top single at RPE 8, blah, blah, blah. Again, we're going to keep it consistent. This is very much going to be the same as the deficit. The first three blocks of these are going to be very similar. Keep that in mind. Because some of the ideas are very much, or some of the goals are just very much the same. So we're still going to have this aspect. We're going to have skill practice with a particular percentage, and then we're going to have our accessories. And again, we're just going to have accessories that's going to maintain muscle mass, etc., etc. So from a maintenance block standpoint, it's going to be very similar to the deficit, but you're actually going to be doing less during this maintenance block. In fact, when you do, say, a pick the accessory, tricep accessory, bicep accessory, whatever the hell you want to do, back accessory. These aren't going to be a little bit higher volume and then we're pushing the volume up every week. This volume is going to be maintenance, and it's going to stay consistent throughout the entire block. Now, what you can do to still make progression here is simply what every gym bro does in the gym, and that's literally just trying to add more weight to each of the movements with the same amount of volume. So you'll be doing 3 sets of chest or whatever your maintenance volume is here. Triceps, say 4 sets, biceps 4 sets, back maybe 5. It really depends, but you're going to stick to this low volume for the span of the whole block. You're not going to have a deload after this. Keep note of that. That's very important. There won't be any deload from a maintenance block because we haven't reached the point where we need extra recovery to get rid of the fatigue. So that's basically a maintenance block. Very, very easy. You can throw in a variation. It can be, honestly, preferably a variation that you are used to, something that you know have always worked for you. That way you can continue to kind of build on that, build the skill, feed into your main lift. If you do a very novel variation, you might not have the focus and ability to put in a lot of energy into it. And so it's not really going to develop much. It's not really going to do much for you. So stick to the things that have always worked for you, hone them. It's about training in a comfortable environment for you to maintain your abilities so that when you come back, you can start focusing and pushing again on very novel things for novel gains. Then, the minimally effective training phase is going to be very similar to the maintenance, but we are going to have not a top single, but say a top set of 5 or whatever. We don't need a top single. There's no point of it. We're not trying to maintain any sort of technical abilities because we'll be doing enough volume to just keep that progressing, and we're still having very effective training. Even though it's minimally effective, still having effective training, especially since the time to use this is between blocks. We're going to throw this in to pull back volume slightly, still get the most of what we're doing, but it's to pull back to resensitize us to better training. And so the idea here in terms of the type of modality that you're going to be doing, in terms of how many sets, reps, and the range of the weight that you're handling, it's going to be based on what you've done prior and what you're going to do after. So if this block is between 2 strength blocks, and the first strength block you did say a range of 5 to 8 reps on the deadlift, and the next one is going to be doubles or something as your top set, you're going to want to work with something in between. Okay, that was a very arbitrary explanation, but you want to stick to roughly the same thing. If you did a hypertrophy block prior, you're doing this now, and then you're going to a strength block where you're doing triples, this is definitely not the point to do singles. It's very abrupt. It's going to be very novel. It's going to take a long time to build on. You're just not going to have enough time to actually make use of something like that. So something that's going to be somewhat similar to what you've done previously and what you're going to do, and then build on that. So let's say a top set of 5. Then we've got some RDLs let's throw in a back down here. I don't know. I'm not programming for a specific person. I'm just putting in something random, arbitrary numbers, arbitrary values, whatever. Let's say RDLs for 3 sets of 7. I don't know why I like 7 so much. I feel like it's so funny that people never program sets of 7, sets of 9. It's always 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. Anyway, but the number of reps just based on the percentage that you're using, so and the intensity of the set, so it doesn't really matter. Then where was I going? So we're going to have our typical training. If this is generally what we were doing before and we'll be doing after, again, your variation is also going to depend on that. If the block you did prior was like some sort of, let's say the block you did prior was RDLs, and now you're moving into stiff-legged deadlift, and the block following is going to be like a pause deadlift or deficit deadlift or something, it's going to be a good time to put in the stiff-legged. Anyway, so now we're going to look at the accessories, and this is going to be the interesting part. So let's take the hack squat. I love the hack squat. You probably already know that. Let's take the hack squat as an example. We want to make the most of the least amount of volume, right? That's the idea of this. So what are we going to do? We are going to prime what we're going to be doing for these accessories. We probably will only have one quad accessory in the entire week because we want the minimal amount, but we want to get the most out of what we're doing. We're just going to be doing 3 sets of 10. It's not really going to be very stimulative. So we want to take the one movement that we've got and we want to saturate the returns from them. So typically what I would like is a top set, a heavy top set that's going to be quite a high RPE, 8 or 9. And then we're going to have a monster set back down. Now it really depends on the exercise and how you're doing it and the rep range that you're working with and whether it's unilateral or whether it's very taxing. If you're doing Bulgarian split squats, I probably won't be giving you a monster set. But regardless, we're going to be doing this for most of our accessories during this phase. So it's going to be a top set of 6, a heavy top set, not necessarily 6, but a heavy top set, and then back downs. What am I doing? And then back downs with a monster set. And this is where we push it. So we say got 2 minutes rest, monster set of, let's say you calculated the amount of minimal effective sets that you need, or minimal effective volume that you need to do will be these 6 sets of quads. You'll have, let's take the mid-range here. I usually take, depending on the rep range, either the lower end, mid-range, or medium, or the end range. Well, not really ever the end range. And multiply it by the amount of sets that you want. So I took the mid-range here, which is 10 reps, and 5 sets of 10 is obviously 50 total reps. It's the idea of a monster set. If you don't know how monster sets work, go look at the video that I made specifically on that. So we're going to have a little monster set here to really become hypoxic. And then if you want, we usually leave it here, if you want to not have such a stimulative first couple sets, then we throw in our drop set, which can be a high rep set of 20 reps or something, RPE 10, with some Maya reps. That's not a tempo. Maya reps to finish it off completely. That's going to be the most crazy thing you can do, and I promise your quads will be destroyed after that. Obviously, everything is going to be zero acceleration here. Make the absolute most and full range of motion as well to make the most of this one movement that we've got. That's going to be the minimal effective phase. We're going to do our normal SBD. We're going to do our variations where we're going to keep our accessories low but very effective to be able to make the most of them. The idea here as well is to have one movement, and typically I go, the general rule of thumb is our main lift and whatever modality we've got, one variation, one specific accessory to drive as much stimulus as possible and nothing more. So the amount of training that we do is very limited, a little bit restricted, but what we saturate from them is going to be, well, we're going to saturate it, right? So we're getting everything out of what we're doing. Lastly, we've got our hypertrophy phase. Very, very easy. You train like a bodybuilder. Now, there are a couple of exceptions in this in the style of training for a powerlifter, and what are they? Well, number one is if we don't squat, bench, or deadlift, we are going to lose our ability to do so well. And even though, so the argument against that would be, well, it's just a short amount of time that you're going to be away from these 3 lifts, which means when you come back, it will be novel, you'll make great gains again, and then you're good to go. The problem with that argument, it's an argument that I used to make for myself and for people around me, is when we don't squat, bench, or deadlift at all, we need to do this hypertrophy for a long time, okay? Building muscle is not easy. It's definitely not quick. So we're going to spend a lot of time in this hypertrophy phase. That's going to be 4 to 6 months minimum. So when we're doing this, we need to understand that we're going to spend a lot of time away from the squat, bench, and deadlift if we don't do them. So what's the better way to go about it? Well, in my opinion, would be to have at least one set of the squat, and because the fatigue muscularly is going to be quite high during a hypertrophy phase, I prefer to be a little bit higher reps. If you go singles, doubles, triples, you're putting a lot of stress on your tissue, and since you are training these muscle groups to very, very high extremes, you're just putting yourself at a risk of injury. So we want to keep the reps slightly higher, but we want a comp specific lift. One set of that. Then we want at least one, maybe two or three, depending on the lift. I mean, if we're doing a deadlift and a very specific RDL, you might need less sets. But we want, I would say, 2 to 3 sets. Goodness, are you really doing that to me? Let's say 3 sets. Okay. This thing does not want to cooperate. 2 to 3 sets of something that is comp specific, but very directed towards hypertrophy still. So in the case of the squat, it's going to be something like an ATG, zero acceleration, high bar squat. Okay, so it's basically a high bar that's a little bit deeper, slower, more controlled. It's going to be very stimulative on your quads, possibly your glutes, definitely your adductors, but it's still very, very similar to a normal squat. Okay, and then you'll be doing all of your quad and hamstring and glute and adductor training on a lower body day, obviously, and have everything else the rest of the week, right? For the deadlift, okay, we're going to have our top set, say 5 or whatever. We're going to have our comp specific, but also hypertrophy specific variation, which can be something like a beltless deficit stiff-legged deadlift. It's one of my favorites. Obviously zero acceleration as well, and possibly like 2 sets of that. Okay, I'm just giving random examples here, but these are quite common just because from a profile standpoint they are somewhat superior, obviously depending on where you feel what muscle groups. But then you'll have, say, the bench, which could be a lot of things. A lot of people like a cambered bar press. I like to do cambered Larsons, zero acceleration as well. Some people get away with a dumbbell press, although for me, I need something with a bar, maybe like an incline press, all of those things, right? That's going to be very stimulative, but also comp specific. And then you'll have, again, of course, all of your hypertrophy specific training. Volume is going to increase significantly. We're going to end up with really, really high volumes to maximize hypertrophy. Deload, start fresh again, and we continue. And that's pretty much the rundown of all of this. If there are any of these phases that you're still unsure of, or you've got questions, please leave them in the comment section. But other than that, that is that. Please like the video, subscribe, and we'll be back with another video shortly. Thank you for watching. I will check you in the next one.